we go, chapter 13. Elizabeth slept straight through to the next morning. She stayed in bed as long as she dared, then slowly dressed and went down to breakfast, where the rest of the family were already eating. Mr. Collins, upon seeing Elizabeth enter the room, stood abruptly from his chair and knocked it over, sending it crashing to the floor. He apologized and hastily went about setting it upright, as Lydia and Kitty snickered into their bread rolls. When Elizabeth noticed that the only available seat was right next to him, she walked slowly, feeling Mr. Collins' eyes on her the entire way, then reluctantly sat down. With great effort, she turned and smiled at him, or at least her mouth curved upward. Her eyes remained cold and unchanged, as she was in no mood for pleasantries. Mr. Collins did not seem to notice, as he immediately sat up straighter in his chair and beamed at her like a dog begging for a treat. Jane, who had been watching Elizabeth closely, leaned over to speak to her. Before she could say a word, Mr. Collins suddenly cleared his throat. After his fourth unsuccessful attempt to attract the attention of the room, Elizabeth turned in her chair and asked dryly, "Are you choking, Mr. Collins?" "No, Miss Elizabeth, I am perfectly well, I thank you." Elizabeth pulled apart her roll distractedly with no intention of eating it. The amount of carbs she consumed at every meal made her feel as though she were slowly turning into cement. Where is the elliptical machine in this place? "I would, however, like to request a private audience with you, Miss Elizabeth, if it pleases your father and mother," Mr. Collins furthered. His voice pulled Elizabeth from her thoughts, and she snapped her head upward toward Jane, who gave her a commiserative look. So, this was it. Collins had finally summoned the courage to ask her to marry him, and his timing literally could not be any worse. Mrs. Bennet's face lit up like a kid in a candy store. She ordered everyone from the room. "Everyone except you. Except for you, Lizzie, of course." Elizabeth watched in horror as her father and sister stood up and began heading for the door, leaving her alone with Mr. Collins. Jane was the last to leave. She gave Elizabeth an expression of pure empathy over her shoulder, then closed the door behind her with a click. Elizabeth sat perfectly still and stared straight ahead at the window. She tried to imagine herself anywhere but in this room, about to be proposed to by the humanization of Kermit the Frog. I wouldn't mind at all being proposed to by Kermit the Frog. He is much more appealing than Mr. Collins, despite his being admittedly green, already taken by Miss Piggy, and most regrettably a puppet with someone's hand up his. "Miss Elizabeth," Mr. Collins stressed, "I am sure that you must be aware of the meaning of my address to you this morning, as you possess the delicate perception of a respectable lady. I want to assure you that I have your mother's permission for my discourse. Indeed, I have her wholehearted consent on the matter." "I'll just bet you do." "Almost as soon as I set foot in the house, I chose you as my companion for my future life," he continued. "In my humble opinion, your amiable qualities set you far above the rest of your sisters." "I'm sure my qualities seemed much more amiable once my mother informed you that Jane was unavailable. Before I am overcome by emotion on that subject, however, first let me give you my reasons for marrying. I came here to Hertfordshire with the intention of selecting a wife." He wiped an imaginary tear from his eye. Oh dear God. Yeah. "My reasons for marrying are thusly. First, that I believe a respectable clergyman, such as myself, with the means to do so, should set the example in his parish for matrimony. Second, I believe it will greatly add to my personal happiness. And third, it is the expressed wish of my esteemed and wonderfully wise patroness. Lady Catherine, after she graciously condescended to give me her opinion on the matter, urging me to find a wife whose disposition and situation in life would best complement my own, I knew at once that I must obey. My greatest ambition in life is to make myself worthy of such a woman as Lady Catherine's attentions. Why don't you marry Lady Catherine? Why don't you just marry Lady Catherine? You must be wondering why I did not seek a companion for life in Hunsford, where there are an abundance of amiable young ladies who would be more than willing to take on such a task. I believed myself obligated to bridge the gap between our families. I wish to extend an olive branch to your father, for the part I must play in the settlement of his estate upon the melancholy event of his death. I therefore sought to choose amongst his daughters, so the loss might be decreased, at least for one of them, whenever that unimaginable event might take place, though we all hope it may not be for many years. I felt my motives to be self-sacrificial, and hope that they will be pleasing to you. Yes, you are a veritable saint. Heaven is surely missing an angel, you exemplary specimen of manhood, you. And now, nothing remains but for me to express my all-consuming affection for you, and to assure you that I am well aware of your lack of fortune, and am perfectly indifferent toward it. I promise that you will never hear a vindictive word pass my lips regarding your less than satisfactory situation when we're married, as I know very well it is not in the power of your father or mother to make any amends for it. Elizabeth cast him a look of disgust at this. Her situation was less than satisfactory to him? It was unbelievable how painfully ignorant Collins was to the fact that he could not be any less in her league. Mr. Collins, she began, although that was quite possibly the most flattering proposal a girl could ever dream of, I'm afraid I must respectfully decline. Mr. Collins waved his hand around, as if to dismiss her refusal completely. I am not at all disconcerted by your refusal. I know very well it is the practice of respectable young ladies to refuse a man that they mean to accept the first time they are asked, even to refuse a second or third. I will therefore consider this an acceptance. Elizabeth stared at him, flabbergasted. Could he really be this thick? Yeah. I am not one of those women, Mr. Collins. I really mean it. I will never marry you. I'm sorry. You are too modest, he cried, smiling. Just one of your many endearing qualities, of which I have written to Lady Catherine. I am sure that she will be more than pleased by your character. And I am sure, Elizabeth returned sardonically, that she will hate my guts when she finds out what I am about to say to you. She took a deep breath. Whatever you choose to say, I know very well that it is merely words. Your actions imply that you are immensely eager to accept. I will not marry you. Elizabeth pronounced the words slowly and clearly, as if she were speaking to a toddler. She thought to herself that even a toddler would have understood her long before this imbecile. Sorry. Your initial refusal, my dear, only promotes my enthusiasm for your inevitable acceptance. For all of the following reasons. First, the fact that I am nowhere near unworthy of your hand. I am more than amiable, and I dare even say desirable. And my establishment is highly advantageous, especially considering my connections with the honorable family of de Burgh. Second, the closeness of my relation to yours. A circumstance you must admit is highly in my favor. I really don't think wanting to marry your cousin is something to be proud of. You should also take into consideration, Collins warned, that despite your numerous attractions, another offer of marriage may never present itself to you due to your grievous situation in life. Your portion is so small that it will most likely negate your amiable qualifications. Wow, this guy is a total ass. Mr. Collins, Elizabeth breathed. Believe me when I say that despite your inconceivable ability to woo a woman, I still must strongly refuse your offer. I don't know what else I can say to get through to you. I am never going to marry you. Not now, not ever, never. She looked at his eager face and added one last, never. I am sure that once I have sanctioned the authority of your parents, my proposal will not fail to elicit a more positive answer. He needled calmly. Elizabeth gave him a venomous glare, then stood and walked toward the door where, as soon as she opened it, Lydia and Kitty practically fell into her arms. Without uttering a single word, Elizabeth slid past them and up the stairs to her room, closing the door firmly behind her before collapsing on the bed. She could hear muffled exclamations from downstairs and assumed Mr. Collins must have told her mother that she refused him. She threw a pillow over her head to block out her voice. The door creaked open and Elizabeth peeked out from under her pillow, feeling relieved when she saw Jane sit beside her. Our mother wishes you to come down and speak to our father, she cautioned. I believe you have refused Mr. Collins? Elizabeth sat up. Yes, and somehow he confused rejection with encouragement. I have never seen such a ridiculously stupid man in all my life. I must agree with you on that point, Jane comforted. I am grateful to you for being his object. I am not sure I would have had the strength to withstand his arguments. Oh, his arguments were legit, let me tell you. At one point, he basically told me that I was poor and no one else would ever want me. Jane gasped. He did not. Although, I suppose he might be correct. We are both unlikely of marrying anyone, due to our lack of fortune, are we not? She asked sadly, gazing toward the window. Elizabeth regarded her profile for a moment. Men who are worth marrying care nothing about money. Or lack of it. She felt her eyes well up with tears that she quickly wiped away with her sleeve. Jane opened her mouth to speak, but seemed to think better of it and stood up instead. Well, you had better come down and hear what our father has to say on the subject, she said. I am sure he will support your decision. Yes, Elizabeth replied, managing a small smile. I have a feeling he will. Mr. Bennet rarely expressed his opinion on any subject. If there was the slightest possibility, it might encourage his wife to speak to him. This time, however, he did indeed side with his favorite daughter. He could not, in good conscience, allow her to marry a man whose mere presence inspired homicidal thoughts. As a result, Mr. Bennet's decision to support Elizabeth inspired homicidal thoughts in his beloved wife, who threatened never to speak to her daughter again if she did not consent to marry Mr. Collins. She was in the throes of one of her many tirades on the subject when Charlotte Lucas happened to stop by. When she entered the house, she was immediately accosted by Lydia and Kitty, who both flew at her, equally desperate to be the first to give her the news. Charlotte! Lydia cried, pushing her sister behind her. You will never believe what has happened. There has been such fun this morning. Yes, Kitty interjected, yanking on Lydia's arm. Mr. Collins has proposed to Lizzie, and Lizzie will not have him. Charlotte stood frozen in the entryway, too shocked to speak as Lydia and Kitty fled past her and up the stairs. She made her way into the drawing room where Mrs. Bennet was draped across the sofa, sobbing into a curiously dry handkerchief. When she noticed Charlotte enter the room, Mrs. Bennet threw her arms around her and begged her to talk sense into Elizabeth, to persuade her ungrateful daughter to think of her mother's poor nerves and comply with her wishes. Charlotte assured her she would do her best. She passed Mr. Collins in the hallway on her way to Elizabeth's room, whose greeting was so enthusiastic. Charlotte wondered if he was even aware he had been rejected. When she opened the door of Elizabeth's bedroom, she found her sitting on the bed, staring vacantly out the window. Charlotte, Elizabeth greeted her. What are you doing here? I came to spend the day, Charlotte answered. Although, judging by how distressed I found your mother, perhaps you would rather be anywhere other than Longbourn? Yes, Elizabeth mumbled. She keeps raising her voice higher to be heard through the floorboards. I'm fairly sure that only dogs can hear her at this point. Are you sure you mean to refuse Mr. Collins? Charlotte questioned. Very sure. Wouldn't you be? As soon as the words came out of her mouth, Elizabeth remembered that in the book, Charlotte had absolutely no objection to him and regretted asking her. She saw her friend's face turn red and decided to change the subject. So, should we venture downstairs and face the music? I hope you're all right with being used as a human shield. Charlotte nodded. I will do whatever need be done. I am certain Mr. Collins is not as dreadful as you have made him out to be. Elizabeth gave her a tactful look. You know, Charlotte, she admitted, somewhere out there might be a woman that could possibly even find him charming. Just not me. She made a face. Definitely not me. They went downstairs, stepping around Lydia and Kitty, who were huddled and giggling at on the bottom step. Her mother and Jane were deep in conversation in the foyer, and when Mrs. Bennet saw Elizabeth, she crossed her arms. Here she comes, now, looking as though she cared very little of the consequences of her actions. But let me say this, Lizzie. If you continue to go about refusing every offer of marriage that comes your way, you will never get a husband at all. And you know perfectly well that I will not be able to maintain you when your father is dead. I am certain I do not know who will. I am done with you. From this day forward, I warned you that I would never speak to you again, and I will be as good as my word. I have no patience for children who think only of themselves and do not take into consideration either their duty to their parents or their mother's nervous condition. She took a deep breath as Mr. Collins entered the room. Elizabeth, sensing an opportunity, slithered between her sister and Charlotte and left the room, leaving her unfortunate friend to feel the attentions of Mr. Collins. She could not resist, however, listening outside the door as he approached his mother and uttered, "My dear Mrs. Collins." Oh my gosh, what's wrong with me? My dear Mrs. Bennet. Sorry. My dear Mrs. Bennet. Please, do not trouble yourself on my behalf. We will forever remain silent on this point, from this moment on. I promise you sincerely that I do not bear any resentment toward the behavior of your daughter. I have already begun to see her refusal as a blessing in disguise, and have resigned myself to the inevitable evil that her acceptance may have incurred. Her temperament not being as compatible with my own as I would have hoped. On closer acquaintance, I believe that she does not possess any of the qualities necessary for the wife of a respectable clergyman. And I am certain Lady Catherine would not consider her to be a paradigm of virtue and submission. I hope you do not consider me to be showing disrespect to your family in any way, as I have refrained from giving yourself and your esteemed husband the compliment of imposing your authority on my behalf. If I have erred in my behavior, I must apologize. My intentions from the first were merely to secure a companion for myself, and if possible, to the advantage of your own family. The conclusion of his speech also concluded any further attention Elizabeth would receive from Collins. He did not look at her or talk to her for the rest of the day. It was a loss she found herself sincerely hoping she might recover from, given time. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins turned all of his attention to Charlotte, who listened to his painfully dull conversation with cheerful alacrity. To her, his overtures were flattering, as she had never been the object of any man's compliments before, much like her real-life counterpart, who unfortunately had always been attracted to narcissists. Elizabeth had been looking forward to ditching Collins and walking to Meryton with Charlotte to search for Mr. Wickham. Instead, she was the third wheel for the day, sitting in a corner of the room listening to them talk animatedly about their favorite biblical passages. Every so often her mother would walk past them under one false pretense or another, muttering accusations under her breath and throwing looks of pure disdain at her over her shoulder at her daughter. Poor Elizabeth, she is having a very rough couple of days here, and I hope it picks up for her, and we'll find out next week. See ya.